You ever watch a slow-motion train wreck? It's horrifying. You can see the disaster unfolding, but there's no way to stop it. That's what's happening between Hungary and the European Union right now. Brussels built the Union on democracy, rule of law, and collective decision-making, but Hungary has spent over a decade defying those principles. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has blocked Ukraine aid, vetoed Russian sanctions, and openly clashed with Brussels authority. The result? For the first time in history, EU leaders are asking a once unthinkable question. Should Hungary still be part of the EU? But there's a catch. The EU can't legally expel a member state. So the real question isn't whether Hungary can be kicked out, but whether Brussels will find another way. And trust me, some EU leaders are already working on exactly that. Since taking power in 2010, Orban has reshaped Hungary's democracy into what he calls an illiberal state, a term that openly contradicts EU values. His government has rewritten Hungary's constitution, placed courts under political control, and restricted press freedoms. Moves that have drawn repeated warnings from Brussels. Financially, Orban has positioned Hungary as the EU's top recipient of subsidies, receiving over 40 billion euros in development funds between 2014 and 2020. Yet, corruption investigations by OLAF, the EU's anti-fraud office, found that 4% of Hungary's EU-funded projects involved irregularities, the highest rate in the bloc. For Brussels, this isn't just about values. It's about power. Orban has used Hungary's EU voting rights to block major decisions, including Ukraine aid packages and Russian energy sanctions. To European leaders, Hungary isn't just a defiant member, it's an internal disruptor. But when Brussels tried to punish Orban through the EU's harshest disciplinary measure, Article 7, it backfired. Article 7 is the EU's nuclear option, designed to strip a member of its voting rights for violating democratic principles. But in 2018, when the EU Parliament triggered it against Hungary, it ran into an obstacle unanimity. Poland, facing its own Article 7 probe over judicial reforms, vowed to block any EU sanctions on Hungary. This wasn't just about solidarity, it was strategy. Hungary and Poland formed a political alliance, knowing that as long as they protected each other, neither could be punished. The result? Article 7 has been stuck in limbo for 6 years, rendering the EU's most powerful enforcement tool useless. So Brussels turned to economic pressure, and that's when things escalated. In December 2022, the European Commission took an unprecedented step. It froze 22 billion euros in EU funds earmarked for Hungary. The reason? Concerns over corruption, judicial independence, and press freedom. But it wasn't just a financial squeeze. It was a political gambit. Hungary's economy is fragile, with inflation peaking at 25.7% in early 2023, the highest in the EU, according to Eurostat. Foreign investment is down 17%, and the Hungarian forint lost over 10% of its value against the euro last year. Facing economic pressure, Orban made limited reforms, but the EU wasn't convinced. In December 2023, Brussels only released 10.2 billion euros, a fraction of the frozen funds. The message was clear: comply fully, or lose more money. But Orban had a backup plan: Moscow. While the EU has poured over 85 billion euros into Ukraine since 2022, Hungary has repeatedly blocked military aid and sanctions against Russia. Orban has maintained energy deals with Moscow, securing a 15-year gas contract with Gazprom in 2021, and continuing to buy Russian oil through pipelines exempted from EU sanctions. Hungary also hosted a Russian-backed nuclear expansion project, the 12 billion euro PAX 2 deal, even after the invasion of Ukraine. This isn't just a diplomatic headache for Brussels, it's a geopolitical crisis. French President Emmanuel Macron warned in January 2024 that Hungary's stance weakens the EU's ability to respond to external threats. Meanwhile, US officials have pressured Brussels to find a way to neutralize Hungary's influence. And that's led to a new question. Can the EU work around Hungary's veto power? With Russia's war in Ukraine reshaping European defense policy, the EU is pushing for a faster, more unified security strategy. The problem: Hungary keeps blocking key decisions. In 2023, the EU proposed a €50 billion Ukraine aid package, but Hungary delayed the vote for months, forcing leaders to negotiate directly with Orban. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated in February 2024, "We cannot allow a single member state to dictate our security priorities." The EU is now considering drastically limiting the use of national vetoes on foreign policy decisions. That would mean Hungary could no longer block major EU actions. But there's a catch: changing EU voting rules requires unanimous approval, meaning Hungary would have to agree to weaken its own power. This leaves the EU with two choices: find a legal loophole to bypass Hungary's veto, or tighten the financial noose until Orban concedes. And some EU leaders are already moving toward a radical option, one that could reshape the bloc forever. In the European Union, a single veto can bring 27 nations to a standstill. Since 2022, Viktor Orbán has used Hungary's Council of the EU veto to block 11 foreign policy measures, including €50 billion in aid to Ukraine, new sanctions on Russian energy, and Sweden's NATO membership bid. His power isn't just symbolic, it's leverage worth billions. According to the European Council on Foreign Relations, Hungary has stalled over 85% of EU foreign policy decisions involving Russia, forcing leaders like Germany's Olaf Scholz and France's Emmanuel Macron into months of direct negotiations to bypass him. This isn't just about political grandstanding, it's an economic strategy. In December 2023, Orban finally lifted his veto on Sweden's NATO membership after securing €10.2 billion in EU funds that had been frozen over rule of law concerns. Critics, including former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, argue that Orban has turned EU foreign policy into an auction house where vetoes aren't about national interest but bargaining power. And while Brussels scrambles for workarounds, Orban is already anticipating the next move. Because if the EU wants to stop his veto power, it would need to change its entire voting system. The European Commission is considering drastic changes to weaken Hungary's veto power, and 2024 may be the breaking point. A coalition led by Germany, France, and the Netherlands is pushing to replace unanimity in foreign policy with a qualified majority system, meaning decisions could pass with the support of 55% of EU states, representing at least 65% of the bloc's population. This shift would sideline Hungary overnight, but there's a legal catch. It requires unanimous approval to change the rules, and Hungary will never agree to that. Instead, the EU is testing creative legal backdoors. In March 2024, the bloc approved a €5 billion Ukraine military aid package by bypassing Hungary's veto entirely, routing the funds through a coalition of willing nations rather than the full EU framework. According to Reuters, Brussels is now exploring similar models for future Ukraine aid and sanctions, effectively creating a two-tier system: EU policies that include Hungary, and EU policies that ignore it. But setting this precedent raises a larger question. If the EU can make major decisions without Hungary, what stops them from making all decisions that way? Officially, no EU treaty allows for expelling a member state, but unofficially, pressure tactics can make staying unbearable. Freezing €22 billion in funds already put Hungary's economy under immense strain, but Brussels has even sharper weapons. One option being discussed among legal experts, including Daniel Kellerman from Rutgers University, is invoking Article 269 of the EU Treaty, which allows financial penalties for nations violating EU laws. If enforced aggressively, it could strip Hungary of billions in subsidies annually, making continued EU membership financially unsustainable. Another approach? Political isolation. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has warned that Hungary's refusal to align with EU principles could force leaders to create an inner circle of European cooperation that excludes Budapest. A similar strategy was used against the UK before Brexit. gradually cutting its influence in decision-making until it became politically infeasible to remain. According to the Center for European Reform, if Hungary keeps blocking core policies, the EU could push it to the periphery, making exit feel like the only viable option. But history shows that the EU has never hesitated to bend its own rules when necessary. The EU has a history of rewriting its own legal framework when political necessity demands it. During the Greek debt crisis in 2015, the EU bypassed standard treaty rules to impose strict bailout conditions, overriding national sovereignty in the process. In 2020, to sidestep Hungary and Poland's threats to veto the EU's €1.8 trillion COVID recovery fund, Brussels created an entirely new legal mechanism linking funding to rule of law compliance, a move some legal scholars called treaty law manipulation. If the EU decides that Orban's Hungary is an existential threat to the bloc's unity, it could once again explore treaty reinterpretations, targeted sanctions, or financial chokeholds. And if Hungary's economy continues to struggle with a weakening forint, record-high borrowing costs, and declining foreign investment, the EU may not even need legal maneuvers. Economic pressure alone could force Budapest to fall in line. Hungary's economic problems are compounding faster than Orban's government can control. Inflation, which peaked at 25.7% in early 2023, has slowed, but GDP growth remains stagnant at 0.6% in Q4 2023, according to Eurostat. Meanwhile, the Hungarian forint lost 10.4% of its value against the euro in 2023, making imports, including energy, more expensive. Foreign direct investment, which accounted for 5.6% of Hungary's GDP in 2019, dropped to 3.2% by 2023, with major European firms reducing their presence due to regulatory uncertainty. EU funding cuts are exacerbating the crisis. Hungary was set to receive €4.6 billion from the EU's 2024 Cohesion Fund, but due to governance concerns, only a fraction has been released. According to Morgan Stanley, without full access to EU financial support, Hungary could face a 2.5% GDP contraction in 2025, severely limiting the government's ability to finance social programs and infrastructure. The big question, at what point does economic survival force Orban to compromise? The standoff with Hungary is no longer just about one country defying Brussels. It's about whether the EU can enforce its own rules at all. If Hungary continues to veto major policies, block security initiatives, and defy rule of law requirements without real consequences, other member states could follow suit, fragmenting EU unity. Political analysts at Chatham House warn that if Brussels fails to rein in Orban, it could set a precedent where nationalist leaders in Poland, Slovakia, or even Italy test the limits of EU authority. But forcing Hungary out carries its own risks. If Budapest is pushed into political and economic isolation, it could drift further toward Russia and China, forming deeper energy, trade, and investment ties outside the EU framework. China has already increased its investments in Hungary by 67% since 2022. Primarily through state-backed infrastructure projects, while Russia continues to provide favorable energy contracts. If Hungary reorients eastward, it could create a permanent geopolitical wedge within the EU itself. The next big move might already be underway. The battle between Hungary and the EU isn't about ideology anymore. It's about control. Can Brussels neutralize Orban's influence without setting a dangerous precedent? Or does this crisis mark the beginning of a new Europe, one where economic pressure, legal maneuvers, and political deals decide who really holds power? Brussels may think it's cornering Orban, but what if Hungary has its own endgame? The real question isn't whether the EU can outmaneuver Orban, but whether he's already one step ahead. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.